are fortunate to have Pamela Uppal-Sandhu joining us from the Ontario Nonprofit Network, and she is the Director of Policy, and she has 10 years of experience building equitable systems across frontline work, research, and advocacy. She holds a master's degree in women's studies and feminist research, and I shall turn it over to Pamela. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to take a quick moment to share my screen. And is that visible for everyone? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time out today to come hear about some data that I wanted to share on your region. Thank you to the United Way and social planning for making this happen. And I'm really excited to be here. I was going through all the data this morning and yesterday and a couple days before, trying to get ready for this presentation. And I hope I can offer you some food for thought at the very least. I will say that, what I'm gonna share probably isn't news to you, but I hope what I leave you with is some sort of story about the sector and what we're sort of experiencing right now that you can leverage and use for your advocacy efforts at the local level. And just wanted to also highlight that our survey report and all our survey work has been supported by the Definity Foundation as well as OTF. So as you may know, my name is Pam. As I was introduced, I'm the policy director at ONN. I go by she, her pronouns, and just adding to the land acknowledgement that was shared this morning, I'm calling in from Toronto, which is the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the First Credit, and really just want to express lots of gratitude for being able to work, live, and play in this area that's been stewarded for time immemorial by Indigenous communities. And a little bit about ONN, if you may not know, our entire sort of focus, our strategic plan, everything is about building a strong, resilient nonprofit sector. We do truly believe that we're stronger if the 58,000 organizations work together, are coordinated, connected, and sharing. We're more resilient and stronger. And a lot of our work focuses on public policy advocacy. So thinking about all the different legislations that impact our sector and sharing that with the sector and whatever's bubbling up from the ground, from organizations like yourself, sharing that with government at the provincial and federal levels as well. We really want to make sure you have the public policy environment to do the work that you do on the ground. We also have a membership-based aspect to our organization, and we also offer a bunch of different services that folks can tap into, like insurance plans and benefits and group rates for pension plans as well. So a bit about what I wanted to share today, a bit of a roadmap. So I'll give you some context about our survey, about a little bit about who filled it out and all of those pieces. I want to share 4-year trends because we were in a really unique spot this year as we had 4 years worth of data, and to sort of share what's been happening with the sector during the pandemic and as we've sort of come out of it. And then I pulled out data particularly about Southwestern Ontario. And so I wanted to share that and some of it in comparison to what the rest of the province is sharing as well. And then I want to end with some advocacy pieces. So what are some policy recommendations we're putting forth? How can the sector sort of activate those? And what are some calls to action we have for the sector? And then we'll have some time for discussion, questions, and all of those pieces as well. But feel free to pop questions in the chat. I'll try to monitor as much as I can if anything is coming up for you as we go through this. And the slides will be available. So you might find them a bit text heavy. That's just because I wanted you to have all the information. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, I'm going backwards. There we go. So our annual state of sector survey, we've been doing for 4 years now. And to be completely honest, we didn't know we would do it for this long. We started doing it in the pandemic, and it really was because so much was happening and we wanted to know what the impact on our sector is so we can advocate better. So we could go to government and say, this is what they're saying, this is what they're experiencing, and have some numbers attached to it. And one survey, 2 weeks into the pandemic has now turned into an annual survey ever since. So one in 2020, 2021, 22, and now 23. This actually, though, is our first survey that doesn't focus on COVID. All the other surveys definitely did, had a lot of questions around that, and as the pandemic evolved as well. And what we ask folks to do is, it's an organizational survey. So we ask an organization to fill it out. It could be anyone who has the best information. It's broken down into like finances, operations, staff and volunteers, that sort of thing. And we ask the organization to really reflect on their last fiscal year. So for this survey, that would have been April 2022 to March 2023. And just to give you a sense of, what's the context when people are filling out this survey, like what are they reflecting on? So for that fiscal year, pandemic restrictions had lifted right before. A lot of the pandemic support, whether for businesses, nonprofits, or individuals, had ended. We're coming to an end for sure. And we actually experienced the peak of inflation that summer. So that's when we saw the 10% inflation rate and cost of living just skyrocket. And so we were sort of people were reflecting on this peaked inflation piece, as well as sort of the affordability crisis that was incited by that. And in terms of public policy, just the context around that, in this fiscal year, we were also getting signals from both levels of government, federal and provincial, around decreased spending, right? There's this narrative that we've spent a lot during the pandemic, where, cost of living is really high, there's not enough money to go around, we need to sort of decrease all of that public spending. So that definitely was visible in the budget announcements that were made. And I think we all know sort of at the municipal level how hard it's been and how much our municipal governments have been struggling to meet demand as their revenues also decrease. So that's sort of just the context in which people are filling out this survey. Why we do this survey, I mean, we get this question quite a bit, so I wanted to share. It's not just for ONN. For sure, for us, it's important because we use this to measure the impact, the way the sector is faring every year. We're tracking long-term changes, and this contributes to our public policy advocacy and our priorities for sure. Right now, it really is going to support a lot of the election readiness work that we want to do for 2026, and really thinking about what are some outcomes we want for the sector out of that election. But time and time again, we've heard how important it has been for nonprofits. And, we actually had a moment this year where we're like, we're not going to do the survey. We're going to take a pause. It's a lot of work. And we just want to make sure we're doing it well. And actually we got calls from the sector saying, you can't stop doing it. You have to continue doing it. It's the only source of data that we can rely on that tells a holistic picture of the sector. And we also got advice around, it's not the fact you don't collect data just to report on it, but you collect data in the event that you can map out exactly when things changed and why. And so that really hit close to home for us. So a lot of nonprofits use this data to advocate to their boards, their committees. They use the data in their granting applications and any funding proposals they put forth, their own advocacy work at a local level. And for all of us, it's a way to maintain a strong and resilient informed network. Not only do we know what's happening across the province, and I think the most powerful piece about the survey is that everyone is experiencing the same thing. At a high level, everyone is experiencing the same thing across regions, across subsectors. How it might play out is nuanced, definitely, and unique to the various parts of the province. But sharing that information, staying on top of our data, and being able to share data in our advocacy efforts really is one of the reasons why we put this forth. So really the purpose of our survey is to measure the state of the sector in one given time, and then to give high quality data back to the sector to use for advocacy efforts. So a bit about the survey this year. In terms of who filled it out, so we had about 22% of respondents from Southwestern Ontario, which was the second biggest region after Toronto, who had filled it out, which is really great because it means a lot of the overall data is reflective of your realities as well. And consistently, Southwestern Ontario has been one of the top 2 regions that fill out the survey, which is great. This year we had 1,400 respondents in total. And so every year we're just, striving to get more people to fill it out, but there is survey fatigue, right? There's lots going on. Not everybody has the capacity to fill this out. So numbers have fallen. At the height of the pandemic, pandemic, we had about 3,000 people filling out our survey, and now we're at 1,400, which is still a good sample size compared to a lot of other surveys. But we're just striving to fill it out. And so encourage you all to fill it out next year as well when you see the value of it today. And the other piece I wanted to point out is like the smaller numbers here. These usually go up and down a couple percentage points every year. But yes, Toronto and Southwestern have stayed the top two number of respondents. We also like to track from which subsector folks have filled it out. No surprise, usually it's social services. They do make up a large portion of our sector anyways, but it's also really important for us to see that arts and culture are here, environment is represented, sports are represented, that there's sort of a nice breakdown distribution of who's filling out the survey, because those stories are equally important as well. Budget size is another big piece, for sure. Depending on what your budget is, how you're responding to questions changes. And we really want to make sure that we also capture the stories and data of our small to mid-sized organizations in our survey. It's been equally distributed this year as well in terms of budget size. I will say we are seeing the larger organizations fill out the survey more and the smaller ones not so much, even though it's equally distributed right now. And that might be a lot of smaller ones are closing or don't have the capacity and resources. And so that's sort of top of mind for us as well as we go into next year's survey. Not a couple years ago, last year, so for the 2022 survey, we introduced two different types of ways for organizations to identify themselves. And that was if they were a Black-led organization, Black serving, Black focused, or all of the above, which would be B3, or if they were an Indigenous-led, Indigenous informed, Indigenous benefiting, an Indigenous partnership, or all of the above, which is I4. And this was important for us to do because we knew that there was a differential impact on organizations that were serving equity deserving communities, that were led by equity deserving communities. And we wanted to make sure we capture that and share that data back out. And because often most of these groups are missing in public policy advocacy and decision making. And so we've been getting some good response rates, quite reflective of how much they make up of the sector that we know of, so about 2% in total. This past year, we also introduced a third type for folks to identify. So that's if they were a 2SL LGBTQIA+ led, serving or focused organization, or all of the above. And so this really helps us pinpoint not just what the whole sector is experiencing, but who in our sector is experiencing how much and how acutely, just alongside budget size, subsector, and region. And so I'm going to head into sort of what our 4-year trends were, and not so great. And I know they won't be surprising to you because you're all on the ground sort of experiencing this firsthand. But as I shared, we were in a really interesting space this year because we had 4 years worth of comparable data, and we really wanted to take the time to share a story of what's been happening with the sector during the pandemic and as we've come out of it. And what we found and what we've sort of been highlighting is that our sector is running on fumes, and we're headed into very unprecedented territory. The three biggest sort of trends that we found were, one, demand for services has sharply increased, and right now it's at an all-time high. So it's about 76% of nonprofits reported that they're experiencing a demand in service this year or for this survey, and that's up 30% from 2020. Most of those that have consistently experienced an increase in demand for services over the past 4 years have been organizations with budgets over 3 million, organizations that are bilingual, and those that are across the health sector, which comes to no surprise. In 2021 and 2023, we actually saw that the sports and recreation subsector and the environmental subsectors had higher rates of demand for services. And that also doesn't come to no surprise because there was so much pent-up demand during the pandemic when we were in restrictions and had lockdowns. And I just wanted to share a quote that sort of speaks to a bit of this. As the demand for our programs continues to grow during the post-pandemic mental health crisis, our inability to raise enough funding and recruit enough youth volunteers will continue to detract from our ability to meet the demand and address our growing waitlist. The second big trend that I wanted to share was that our financial situations are in a downward spiral. And by what I mean by that is that when we're talking about increase in revenue, only some nonprofits over the years are reporting an increase in revenue. So about 40% over the years have said they've seen some increase in revenue. But that's mainly been for the larger organizations. The smaller organizations are still more likely to report that they're seeing decreasing revenues. And when we look at the costs and how much expenses have gone up, those revenue increase cannot keep up. Cost increases are outpacing that. So about 90% of the sector said that they were experiencing some sort of increase in costs over the past year. Or over the past year, and over the 4 years, it's again at the highest level. When we're thinking about reserve funds, nonprofits are increasingly having to dip into the reserve fund. So more and more every year are dipping into those reserve funds and using them. We also asked the sector to forecast how long can you sustain yourselves based on your financial situation today. And more we're seeing that organizations are saying we're less likely to sustain ourselves for more than 12 months. We're more likely to only be able to sustain ourselves for either less than 6 months, less than 7 months, less than 3 months, so on the shorter end of time. We also ask folks to forecast optimism. Do you think your situation is going to get better? Your financial situation, if it's going to get better? And we're seeing the same trend here over the past 4 years. Optimism is decreasing. More and more are saying that they expect their situation to get worse. Less are saying that they expect their situation to get better or stay the same. We've been measuring the human resource crisis in our sector for the last 2 years. So in this sort of pocket, which I'll dig into deeper in a little bit, the crisis level has remained the same since last year. So last year, 65% of the sector had reported that they were experiencing some sort of issues in attracting and recruiting staff and volunteers, and that number is exactly the same this year. We had high levels of folks reporting job vacancies last year, same number this year. And so that just means that a lot of the crisis or a lot of the human resources issues are plateauing and at very, very high levels. We also measured volunteer crisis in our sector. Last year, we had at least 2/3 of the sector reporting difficulty in all issues related to volunteers, recruiting volunteers, volunteers retiring, attracting young volunteers. That has slowed a little bit. I would more so maybe 1/3 of the sector is now reporting that. But I will say who are experiencing those, it's very acute for them. So even though our quantitative numbers are saying it's slowing, when I looked at our qualitative data, so a lot of the open-ended questions and comments people left, those that really heavily rely on volunteers or have volunteer-run programs are very nervous and are still in crisis and are perhaps a step away from a lot of these programs closing if they can't continue to recruit volunteers. Last year, we also started to measure the impact of the staff and HR staff and volunteers crisis on our services as nonprofits. And so cutbacks, so that's, discontinuing programs or scaling back programs, wait lists, and closures are in line with last year, and they were pretty high last year. So many are still reporting that they're discontinuing programs. Many are still reporting that their wait lists are increasing or growing. That has plateaued at a high level, and I imagine that's because I think people are just either stopping to adding people to their wait list. The wait lists are so long. In terms of nonprofit closure, so we ask people to share with us, what do you know of a similar organization in your network, your region, your subsector that has closed within the last year? And that's in an all-time high. So 35% had said we know someone who has closed down that's similar to us. And that's highest that it's been over the past 4 years. Something else that we did this year because of the 4-year data is do some projections and forecasting ourselves. So we said, if the numbers sort of stay, the rate of change stays the same, there's no public policy shifts, what would the sector look like? What would these numbers look like in 4 years? And so the 3 big numbers that I want to share is they're harrowing, they're very scary, but in 2026, if nothing changes and we continue down the path that we are going down right now, 63% of our sector is going to know someone who has shut down or who has closed. Everyone's going to be experiencing an increase in demand for services, and costs at this point will go up to 131%. And I share this not to be scary, but to share what's at stake in our communities. When a nonprofit shuts down, one here, one there, but when you really start adding it up, they become gaping holes in our social safety net. And we know who ends up slipping through the cracks when that's happening. And the other reason we wanted to share this with the sector was to really think about, where can we influence? Where do we have power? Where can we advocate to make sure that the outcomes for our communities are better? And so 2026 is also an election year, which is why it sort of lined up pretty well. So I'm using a lot of this information to advocate to our local governments and our provincial and federal counterparts around, if nothing changes, you're not going to be able to rely on the sector like you have for the many, many past decades. So maybe I'll just pause there because I also realize I share a lot of information. I do want to go into regional highlights, but maybe I'll pause to see if anybody had any questions or comments or reflections on just the 4-year trends and projections. Or maybe validation, or, or if this is new information or this is something that you're experiencing and seeing on the ground.
And you can just unmute and speak, or if you prefer to raise your hand virtually, you can do that as well. Not seeing anything, but this certainly is on track with things that we've heard and seen as well.
So jumping into the regional highlights, so I wanted to share data, particularly about your region. So, how did your region answer all the questions in our survey? In terms of who filled it out, interesting, well, maybe not interesting for you, but compared to the rest of the province, a higher number of organizations and communities identified themselves to be located in rural, remote, or northern. So 33% of your respondents had said that. And higher than the provincial average, again, 4% said they were unincorporated, grassroots, or community groups. We did not have any respondents who identified themselves as B3 or 2SL, but we did have 2% of respondents say that they were an I4 organization. So that was good. And half of the respondents had said that they had budgets under 500,000. So that's sort of the profile of who had filled out the survey. When we had asked about operations, again, higher than the provincial average for sure, 38% said that they owned their space, while only 27% said that provincially. 75% that said that they engage in some sort of data collection, and that's lower than the provincial average of 81%. And the increase in demand for services was in line. 76% had said it in Southwestern, and that's what the rest of the province had said as well. This year, we added 2 new data points around demand for services. So one is, how much of an increase in demand have you seen? And the second was, can you meet demand? So for your region, most said that they saw an increase of up to about 25% increase in demand for services, but only 21% said that they can meet demand right now in their communities. Shifting to the finances part, 31% said that they can only sustain themselves for 12 months or more, and that's actually higher than the provincial average. 92% said they saw an increase in costs, very much in line. Most said that they saw an increase of up to 24% in costs. In terms of your biggest budget line or expense, definitely salaries, which is of no surprise and is consistent across the province. That's people drive our sector, and that's where most of our budget goes. 27% had accessed their reserve fund in your region, and 16% had said they do not have a reserve fund. This also was in line with the provincial average. When we asked, what is the most significant financial issue that they're facing, we got the highest response was that it was difficult to build a reserve fund. And this was interesting because we asked, is it access to unrestricted funds? Is it access to, what else could it be? And it was actually still building a reserve fund. Sorry, Will?
Yeah, I was just curious with that first number, 31% reported they can only sustain themselves for less than 12 months. And does that mean just like with their sort of existing funding, or like if they had no additional income? Like, I just want to be clear about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So it's just based on what they know about their financial situation when they answered the survey. So based on your current financial situation and your, assumptions and the information that you have, how much longer can you sustain yourselves for? So definitely that can change, right? But in that snapshot, in that moment of time. And sorry, I forgot to mention this survey was in the field this past June. So right after the fiscal year had ended for most. 50% reported an increase in some revenue. Oh, Catherine, sorry.
No, that's okay. So similar to Will's question, so is that without any further funding?
That's
that
just,
kind of what they have in the reserves?
Just, with reserves, whatever their financial situation is on the day that they answered the survey. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you.
No problem. Great questions. 50% reported an increase in some revenue. So this is slightly higher than the rest of the province. The rest of the province, about 43% had said that they experienced some sort of increase in revenue. And so yours was a little bit higher, but really most said that it was an increase between 1% to 24% or 1 to 49%. So not a significant increase. And most also, at least half of those that had said they experienced an increase in revenue said it was mostly because they had an increase in earned income, which is interesting. So that's membership dues, right? Any sort of fee for services folks are doing, any other way that maybe they have a social enterprise, any way that they're earning earned income. So it wasn't due to more donations or provincial government funding or private funding, but because their earned income activities had increased. Optimism in the region around financial situations improving is better than the rest of the province. So about 33% said that they were optimistic that their financial situation will improve. And that's higher than the provincial average of 25%. And of worsening, so only 11% said that their financial situation will worsen, and that's lower than the provincial average of 16%. Will?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I understood. So 50% of respondents from our region reported an increase in some revenue, and then 49% of that 50%?
Yes.
Reported that was due to earned income? Okay.
Yes. And this was the revenue sources question I wanted to share. So we asked folks to sort of share with us what percentage of their budget or who was, how would they break down their budget essentially? Where were all their revenue sources coming from? And for the region, so it goes higher to lower like this clockwise. So most had said provincial government make up a large portion of their budget. But again, it's not like 50%, 30%. It's quite in line with the rest of the province too. And then individual donations make up about 13%. Earned income, fundraising. So this is sort of like the breakdown of revenue sources for the region in terms of how people responded. And quite in line, I would say, with the rest of the province as well. Because there's often this misconception that the biggest revenue source is government funding, and that's not the case. And that is not the case in this region and not the case provincially as well. That there's much diverse revenue sources of the sector. Definitely government funding makes up a bigger portion than the rest, but it's not significant portion, I would say. And then shifting to staff and volunteers. So 49% of respondents for Southwestern Ontario had a job vacancy of some sort, and most of them had a job vacancy rate between 1 to 9%. 62% reported experiencing staffing challenges with recruitment and retention, in line with the provincial average. 72% reported turnover, which is just slightly lower than the provincial average. The provincial average was 77%. And then 47% reported difficulty recruiting new volunteers, while a third reported all the other volunteer-related issues, like loss of volunteers, volunteers retiring, etc. And this is actually higher than the provincial average. So I would say the volunteer crisis is probably a bit more acute in your region. And here I wanted to share some graphs around some other questions that we asked about volunteer staffing and volunteers in the province and then in your region. So this graph shows what factors have affected nonprofits' ability to recruit and or retain staff in 2023 survey. So the dark blue is the rest of the province, and the light blue is how your region responded. So you can see it's quite in line in terms of, skills shortage, staff burnout and stress is slightly a bit more than the rest of the province. Compensation package is a bit less than provincial average. Lack of funding is lack of funding is a bit more, and lack of candidates. So that's really interesting, right? Seems like the number one issue impacting your ability to recruit and retain people is just lack of candidates, much higher than the provincial average as well. And you can sort of see it going down. Lack of affordable childcare actually was also higher than the provincial average. Not the number one reason for sure, but lower. And I think, sorry, did someone unmute?
Yeah, I did, Pamela. I was just wondering, was there anything about lack of housing that impacted ability to hire? Was that a category, or did it come up?
It wasn't a category. That's a really good question. Yeah. When we put this together, survey questions were put together in like April and March of last year. March, April, May. And housing wasn't something we had thought about. I think the housing crisis wasn't as top of mind at that point. And definitely not as top of mind it impacting our workers and our staff and all of those pieces. More so maybe impacting communities we serve, which is a mistake because our workers come from the communities we serve, right? But yeah, it wasn't one of the categories. I don't think it was reflected in the other piece as well. But definitely something that I think we would like to add for the next survey, to really pinpoint the housing component to it. I will say we've been to 3 different regions or 3 different cities doing regional events this year in the fall, actually. So we were in Thunder Bay, we were in Kitchener-Waterloo and Prince Edward County. And what we consistently heard in those cities is a lot of population shifts, a lot of new folks coming to live there, which is driving up cost of living. And many who move don't necessarily work there. They're either doing remote work or traveling back into Toronto to work as well. And I think that might contribute to the lack of candidates in the area to recruit and retain from. And I think we pointed out the staff burnout and stress and lack of funding. I think these were sort of the top 3 factors impacting recruitment and retention in the region. This year, we also asked people to, share with us, where do they think people are going? If they're not able to recruit or retain people, where are they going? And particularly what you see here is we asked people, if you had a turnover in your organization in the past year, where can you estimate that they went? Maybe they knew, maybe they estimated. And again, like sort of going clockwise, we're losing a lot of people to the public sector. This has been quite consistent across the province. Actually, the provincial average was a lot higher. It was 37% had said that they're losing people to the public sector for the same job, or losing to another nonprofit for the same job. And then everything else was sort of split. So it's like 37% public sector, 37%, 33% to another sector, and then everything else was equally split for the province. But what's interesting here is people are changing careers as well. That wasn't the top reason in the province. Retirement, this number actually was the highest across regions. People are leaving because they're retiring. About 8.5% had said that they're going to the for-profit for a similar job. This was also higher than other regions. They said, reporting that people were not working, that after this job, they were not working. That might have something to do with childcare as well. My sense is starting their own consulting business, not sure. Yeah, so going to another nonprofit and the public sector. So again, in line in terms of the top two places people are leaving for with the province, but the percentages are quite less than the provincial averages. So that's interesting. And the retirement piece. The other piece I wanted to share here, the title's wrong, sorry. But what the title should say is that, we also asked folks this year to talk about what are they implementing? So you're, experiencing an HR crisis, you can't recruit and retain people, you sort of have a sense for where they might be ending up. So what are you doing? What are some strategies that you're implementing? So these are all the strategies that we had put down that we knew of or could think of. Definitely there was another category as well. So again, the dark blue is all the provincial average, and the light blue is how your region responded. So flex working hours remains the top both for the province and for the region. Remote work is a bit higher, whereas it's for the province versus the region here. Raising salaries, also a little bit higher across the province. Mental health support's higher. So in general, it seems like folks are still, in line with the province in terms of what they're implementing, what strategies they're implementing, but perhaps not at the same rates, and it's a bit more distributed across. Signing bonuses was the only one that the region isn't doing, and it's already a very, very small percentage of the whole province anyways. And this is the data point that I wanted to highlight that was interesting. Higher than the provincial average, folks reporting that they haven't implemented any strategies to recruit and retain people. I think it's 18%. Whereas only 15% provincially had said that. Which might sort of speak to the fact of not having a candidate pool to recruit from in the first place. So you're not implementing any strategies, is another sort of analysis piece to that.
Pamela, I'll just let you know we're looking at 11:14 right now.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. So this graph is showing you skills shortage. Sorry, all my titles got mixed up in the last two slides. But we also wanted to ask the sector, what types of skills shortages are you facing? And this is a very strategic and deliberate question because we know the province has a big focus on skills development right now, and so does the federal government. A lot of funding, a lot of money is going to like upskilling, changing skills, developing skills, that sort of piece. And so we wanted to be able to present some numbers around what is the skills shortage breakdown in our sector, and perhaps this is helpful for you as a region to think about what you could advocate for in these pots of funding that might be coming down. It's quite in line with the rest of the province, no surprise. I just think there's more of a distribution versus concentration in the in what skills are missing for your region versus the province. Fundraising is the #1 skill shortage people are reporting, which is not a surprise, right? It's, you know, as revenues decrease and costs increase and demand goes up, everyone's looking for a way to be able to get more money into their organization to sustain themselves, particularly when donations and charitable giving and all of that are down as well. So really thinking about fundraising, how to increase fundraising to bridge a lot of those gaps in revenues. So that's the #1 skills shortage. Communications, IT and tech, also not surprising given the digital sort of push we've had during the pandemic, and now it's not an option to not be digital, especially with remote work being a big piece and remote service delivery. And I also think about the geographics, like piece about your region. It's so much more geography, more space, more area to provide services in versus like Toronto or other cities. And so really thinking about how that impacts the IT and tech piece. Grant writing, data, all of these, the rest were sort of similar. And 8.5 said that we're not facing a skills shortage. I think this might also then tie back to, again, not having a candidate pool. So if you don't have a candidate pool, you can't really, maybe you're not measuring if you're facing a skills shortage or not. Finance was a big one too. The other interesting piece about this has been, and it's not just in the region, but generally across the province, we're not facing a skills shortage in what we do best. Program delivery, program design, public policy and advocacy, GR, we're facing a skills shortage of the operational roles. So your IT, your tech, your HR, your admin, your finance, everything that makes our organizations run. And usually that falls on who? The ED, right? Whereas the ED is like, I want to be able to just do my job and connect and serve communities versus having to figure all of this out. And we're also not able to recruit and retain for those jobs because everybody needs those jobs and they're getting paid a lot more in other sectors, to be quite frank. You could be an HR specialist, finance specialist, IT specialist, and work in the for-profit sector or even a small business and probably get paid a lot more than us. And that sort of goes back to, you know, what do our funding structures look like? Do we have funding that supports a lot of these backbone roles and operations, et cetera, that are so key to running an organization and reduces burden, definitely on the ED and the rest of the team. And Catherine?
I was going to say that I would say we're not lacking in these skills necessarily, but actually sometimes the skills to actually do the job that we need them to do, right? So we're a mental health and addiction organization, and so to, you know, the people have the skills to do the counseling and case management and you know, housing support and that sort of thing. I would say those sometimes are the skills that we're actually having a hard time, which is, you know, feeding into our difficulties recruiting, is because, you know, people that are just aren't qualified that are applying.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Thanks for adding that. And I think that's like the other reason why we like going into different networks and sharing the data, because a quantitative only tells one story and it tells the aggregate, right? But you don't get into the nuanced piece. And so if you just look at these numbers, you know, it's one story, but what you've shared, there's another aspect to it. So these were the responses to the impact on communities piece I had mentioned earlier. And so again, you'll see dark blue is 20 all respondents, and then light blue is Southwestern Ontario. And so quite in line here in terms of programs and services being scaled back, more saying that wait lists are increasing, more saying programs and services are discontinued. And then this is just, those that didn't want to answer the question, and some said other. But quite in alignment with the rest of the province. So these are just some of our sort of sense-making pieces, because like I said, numbers just tell one story, and also we don't know why that's happening. So part of our work is to be able to share, why do we think these are the cases? Why do we think these trends are happening? Whether over the past 4 years, whether in the past year, and you have the best sense of why these trends are happening at the local region and manifesting at the local region. So some analysis pieces I wanted to share for the whole province. It's no surprise that we have an increase in demand for services, because more folks rely on the sector for support as they're experiencing more complex and ongoing social issues. We've gone from a public health emergency to an affordability crisis to many climate emergencies happening. And so of course folks are going to turn to us, and we're going to experience an increase in demand. What's to note is that the time between different emergencies is getting less and less. And so how do we prepare as a sector when we know our services are going to be needed more than ever in emergencies, but also as more people need care, as our elders age, as we need more childcare, as we need more care in other ways, mental health and addictions, as Catherine had also mentioned. And so how do we prepare for that when we don't have the time and we might be in a cycle of chaos and crisis? Population shifts definitely impact service demand, but as well as who we can hire. And that could be on both ends of the spectrum, not having enough people, not having qualified people, and not having, the skills that you might need. I also want to share that, there's this sort of also narrative that, well, everyone's experiencing inflation, all industries can't recruit and retain people. But what's important to stress is that perhaps we're at the whims of our context much more than other industries. And so what I mean by that is, if there's economic uncertainty, that directly means we're going to have a decrease in charitable donations. We're going to have a decrease probably in government funding. That's going to impact how we do our work, right? If there's more emergencies, more ongoing complex social issues happening, that means we're going to see a direct increase in demand for our services. And that's perhaps not the same for many other industries. And in terms of the HR crisis, the first year that we were reported on this, not much was happening in the sector. People were just sort of taken like, what's happening? And, part of it might be they've always experienced some sort of recruitment and retention issues, and the pandemic moment and inflation was sort of a bit different. But this year we're seeing that the sector is trying to do something, that they're not just waiting and relying on someone else to sort of fix those problems. But we know that's not enough. Many of the issues that we're facing are systemic in nature. I did talk about the volunteer crisis, so I won't go over that. I did want to highlight also the difference of inflation on our sector. Again, yes, everyone's experiencing it, but we end up experiencing it in two ways: increasing community needs because of inflation or because cost of living is going up. And then it also increases our operations and costs generally as an organization. And stressing really that, even if it's just one nonprofit here, another one there, these small tears in our social safety net are going to become big holes, right? Who takes on now the community that's not being serviced anymore? And whoever takes them on, or do they have enough staff? Do they have enough funding? Do they have enough resources to be able to support that community that no longer has services? And so that just increases demand all around. And we know that, as nonprofits close, and if there's less and less of them, it drives up costs and demand on other care institutions like hospitals, long-term care, jails, treatment centers, and all the other places. We know that community care plays a really specific and important role in our continuum of services and social safety net in the province. And so what happens when that starts disappearing? I'll just maybe wrap up my policy recommendations, then we can sort of come back to this. And so we every year with our survey report, we put forward some policy recommendations for the province to implement. And we sort of focused this year again on 5 big pieces, and these are very similar to, if not the same actually, that we shared last year. And that's because there hasn't been much movement on this, and we want to be able to stress that to government. The 5 things that we're asking for: one is a home and government for our sector. So there's 50,000 nonprofits and charities, and many of these are dealing with 4, 5, 6 different line ministries, and many of them are doing work that intersects with a lot of these different ministries. And so we don't want to replace relationships that you have with your aligned ministries, but we want to be able to have maybe an associate minister responsible for nonprofits that can sort of coordinate, be a cabinet champion, can really bring forth issues impacting our sector in government, and can also connect the dots for them, right? That there's sector-wide issues that impact everyone, like labor, like regulations, that aren't necessarily about the funding and not necessarily about the way in which we service communities, but how we operate as an organization, and how we drive economic impact too. We're an economic engine, and sort of wanting that to be represented. So we're asking for an associate minister for nonprofits and charities and innovation in the Ministry of Economic Development. We're also asking the province to increase funding for the sector, and whether that means wage parity, whether that means increase in base funding for everybody who's asking for it, or that means just better transfer payment agreements. The sector shouldn't be waiting 6 months into a fiscal year to receive their budget, or should be able to have more control over their transfer payment agreements. We're particularly asking for some more investment into equity deserving communities, particularly our partners in I4, B3, 2SL organizations who are disproportionately impacted by a lot of the things that I've talked about today. And so wanting to make sure that they have support as well. We're also asking for some support around building a labor force strategy and workforce development plan for a sector, very similar to what's happening with skills trade right now. How can we really harness all the power of the sector and really come together to create something, to create a critical way in which we recruit and retain people, instead of each individual nonprofit trying to figure that out for themselves. And no time like today to really modernize volunteerism. Volunteerism has changed drastically over the last 2 decades, but particularly over the last 4 years. And volunteering is so important, right? We know people donate where they volunteer. Civic engagement is volunteerism. Being engaged in our democracy and to have a thriving democracy, volunteerism is so important. And so really wanting to push for that as a volunteer strategy from the province as well. So these are the recommendations that we're pushing forth. And what I'll end with is what individual nonprofits can do. Really, encouraging you to all connect and collaborate in spaces like this, share your story, share information, share what's happening across the board, so you can have stronger networks and stronger support systems, and that leads to better advocacy and outcomes. Try to develop allyships with other people in your region. We found, chambers of commerce can be a good ally. A workforce development board or your local economic development board might be a good ally. Someone who's not part of the sector and perhaps, also wants the same things, creating healthy and well-being communities. And who they also have a stake in that. And so how can we sort of build allyships with them to bring that message in our advocacy efforts? Advocacy is always better if a group does it together versus one person. And particularly in this time, really decentering. It's not just about Toronto or the GTA, but really thinking about what are some local issues coming up for you, and how to highlight that to your local MPPs, your local MPs, your local funders, and really staying on top of that, right? It doesn't have to be onerous in the sense, tracking and doing it all the time, but just simple meetings and invites. Hey, this is what we're hearing from our communities. This is what's happening in your constituencies, and MPPs and MPs are much more likely to engage with their local organizations. Also pushing the nonprofit difference. There is something to be said about the way in which the nonprofit different. The nonprofit business model is better situated to provide a lot of the services that you are providing. And again, that specific important role we play in communities and in community care. Research shows we have better outcomes, we deliver services better. And so just making sure that's top of mind and people know that as well. And then the last piece really is encouraging local community support. You have clients walking in, you're connected to communities, you probably show up for communities. Essentially, they're the voters at the end of the day, or most of them are voters. And so how do we continue to engage and connect with them and make them and highlight how important the nonprofit sector is in your communities, and to make sure that's reflected in public policy? And yeah, that's about it. All of this is online. I'll put the link in the chat. We have a bilingual data sheet that you can go through, as well as a dashboard. We have a data highlights report. There's a policy report that has the 4-year trends we talked about. We also have a survey webinar coming up next week on how to use the data, how to sort of put that data together. And a couple of blog pieces coming out. So we're trying to share as much data as we can. There was a lot, and it's hard to share it all in one resource. And I'll pause there. Any questions?
We've got a couple comments here in the chat. And I'm gonna stop recording. So we're gonna be posting the presentation on our YouTube for folks to watch, but for the chat or the discussion, I'll end that. So let's stop.